Welcome to Attenuation, a podcast where two friends come together to drink beer, discover brewing history, and delve into the latest trends in the ever-evolving world of craft beer. From hobby IPAs to rich stouts, we are your companions on this hop-forward journey. If you enjoy your time with us, we invite you to become a weekly listener and subscribe to the podcast. And now, grab a pint, sit back, and enjoy this episode of Attenuation, a beer podcast. Welcome to Attenuation, a beer podcast. We recently connected with a very special person from the world of craft beer. Renee DeLuca is the daughter of craft beer legend Jack McAullife. Jack opened New Albion Brewing in Sonoma, California in 1976, making it the first microbrewery in the United States. His brewery, his beers, and his brewing techniques inspired some of today's biggest names in craft beer and truly sparked a revolution. Renee has taken over the task of telling Jack's story, brewing New Albion beer, and making sure the legend of New Albion Brewing is not forgotten. She very graciously agreed to join me on the podcast to tell her story. She also clears up some mistakes we made in our original deep dive episode. Renee's story is one of romance, chance meetings, beautiful relationships, and of course, beer. So sit back, grab a cold one or three, and enjoy my conversation with the brewer's daughter, Renee DeLuca. Hello, and welcome to this special episode of Attenuation, a beer podcast. My name is Steve, and missing my co-host Jason today. He's the one that usually does this intro, so I'm floating in some weird waters right now. But I'm very, very excited to be here today with wonderful guest who has graciously given us her time tonight and her wonderful expertise and knowledge of both beer and the history of New Albion Brewing, which we did an episode on a few months ago. She came across it and she wanted to give us some good updates, clear up some history, fix some mistakes, hopefully. And and we're just excited to have her. So this is Renee DeLuca, and she is the daughter of Jack McAullife, who is, I like to call him, I consider him the father of the modern craft beer revolution, one of the earliest people to open a microbrewery in the United States, and inspired many people like Ken Grossman of Sierra Nevada and Vinny Chilurzo from Russian River. Just had a great influence on what I could consider the best beer in the world, honestly. So just very excited to have Renee here. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me on. I heard your podcast and I thought you did a very nice overview, especially of the past, but it started to get a little murky when you started to talk about the revival, which is what I've been a part of. So I thought maybe I could help clarify some things. And, you know, I never shy away from talking from New Albion because it's a great thing to talk about.
Well, that's good. I love talking about beer, and I love talking about the history of beer, and especially the history of this modern craft beer in the United States. So I'm very excited for this. Let's start out by maybe just sort of your history. I know you didn't grow up with Jack.
No, it's quite a story. I'm an adoptee. I was adopted as an infant. My birth mom and Jack met at a co-ed boarding school on the border of Maryland and Pennsylvania. So whoever thought it was a great idea to put some teenagers together, you know, in a living situation, thank you. That's why I exist today. So think about that in the 60s. So I'm just giving away my age right here. But think about in the 60s. Back then, you know, if a woman found herself pregnant and not married, the situation was you would go visit your aunt, which my birth mom, Linda, she and Jack were at West Nottingham Academy together. Towards the end of her senior years when they had their little fling, and it was not a high school like if you and I went to high school and we were in the town with the people we grew up with, we've known them our whole lives. They were kind of tossed together and came from different cities. And so upon graduation, Jack went back to Michigan, and for a while he was enrolled in engineering school in college in Michigan, but then enlisted in the Navy, which you talked about when he was in the Navy, and then went to Scotland, where he learned to appreciate fine ales, porters, and stouts, and was a welder at the nuclear locks over there. But Linda, upon graduation, found herself at home and pregnant in Maryland, and her parents sent her to a home for unwed mothers, which was typical of the time. And so I was adopted by a lovely couple who raised me, and they always talked about, the fact that I was adopted, so it was not a big mystery to me, although they didn't have the details. So I was an adult when I found Linda. That's a whole other story. But she led me to finding Jack. And when I did find him, I was an adult with a daughter myself, and he was living in San Antonio, Texas, and had left the brewing industry, as you mentioned. He was kind of that mythical figure that started this whole craft beer revolution and then just kind of was like, I'm out, and disappeared.
Yeah, I call him the J.D. Salinger of craft
Yes,
beer.
that's a great parallel. Absolutely.
So probably actually not an easy guy to find, or was it like for you? Like the craft beer world couldn't find this guy, so.
Well, so it was a matter of the fact that we were in the internet age, and my husband, Paul, put a note on a McAullife genealogy website without telling me, looking for Jack McAullife, class of 63, West Nottingham Academy. And he got a response that said, that's my brother, Jack. What should I tell him? Who's looking for him? And that was my Aunt Kathy, Jack's sister. And she would occasionally search for his name online because she wanted to see if anything was being written about him and the beer. And so that popped up. So very sheepishly, Paul told me, I think you might have found your dad, and you might want to reach out. And so he knew I was a little reluctant about it, but in the end, he knew I really wanted to know. My father that raised me, lovely man, had passed away when I was in my early 20s. We're now in my 30s. I had a child. So once you have a child and you're thinking about your genealogy and your history and things like that.
Yeah.
So I reconnected with my aunt first, his sister, and I sent her some photos in an email. And she looked at them and said, welcome to the family. You look so much like so-and-so and so-and-so in the McAuliffe clan. And so it was fortunately a very happy reunion. But the thing was, I love this part of the story. She had told Jack, someone is looking for you on the internet. Now, my dad was notoriously kind of an off-the-grid guy, had never married. And he said, well, don't tell them where I am. But a few weeks after she initially told him that, he said, okay, Kathy, I know that you are a curious person, so who's looking for me? I know you found out. And she said, well, Jack, do you remember a woman named Linda from West Nottingham Academy? And he had fond memories of her. And she said, well, Linda had a little baby, and guess what? You're the dad. And he allegedly told her it's a communist conspiracy. So that was his first reaction to finding out he was a father.
Awesome.
But just makes me laugh today. So Paul and I made plans to go down to San Antonio. My grandfather, Jack's father, John McAuliffe, Posy, was still alive.
Oh, wow.
And he was curious to meet me. And so I went to San Antonio with Paul. We had a lovely weekend with Kathy. I met also their sister Margarita. They had another brother, Tom, who was living in Chicago. I didn't get to meet him right away. Mozzie, we called them Posy and Mozzie, my grandparents, Jack's parents. At that point, she was in dementia care. So I didn't get to know her as well, but I did get to meet her before she passed. But Posy was quite lively, and over the years formed a great relationship with him as well as Jack, and got to take my daughter to his 90th and 95th birthday party in San Antonio. So, I mean, it's really a lovely story, but
kind of a wild trip to just kind of get a whole new family basically and get to meet all these cool new people. And it sounds like they were pretty welcoming to you.
Yeah. And if it wasn't for the beer, honestly, the connection might not have been made, because that was why Kathy was kind of looking for his name on the internet, anything new written about Jack. So we went down there, and Jack was living in a little cabin down by the Medina River, and he prepared a lovely barbecue for us out on these picnic tables with fine china, cloth napkins, and he was kind of being wary of me the whole time. And at one point he said, Renee, come up to the house and help me with some things. So I went up, and he looked at me very closely and he said, "How about this?" I have this little cleft in my chin, not as noticeable as his, but he goes, "How about that?" And I go, "How about that? Isn't this kind of crazy?" He's like, "It is." But I felt like that was his saying,
Like, okay.
"I accept you. It's cool." So after we ate, he also brought out some old magazines that he had, like old Brewer's Digest and things like that. He wanted me to learn about his history with New Albion, even though it's not what he did anymore. And after we ate, he said, "It's time for a proper illumination." And I said, "What is a proper illumination?" He said, "We're going to blow some shit up." And he had fireworks for us. He's an interesting guy.
Yeah.
You alluded to that in your earlier podcast. He's, he can be bristly sometimes, but he's also very social and super smart, just off the charts smart. Obviously, this guy who went to Europe at a very young age and learned to brew and came back to the United States, and people will ask him, "Jack, what made you decide to start a brewery in the heart of wine country?" He goes, "Because that's where I effing lived." So it wasn't any great grand scheme that he had, but he tells so many great stories. And I did get to be a fly on the wall on a number of occasions with him, with Jim Cook from Boston Beer, and certainly Ken Grossman from Sierra Nevada, who, by the way, was a teenager when Jack started New Albion. And Ken has written about this in his book. He would go up to New Albion and kind of try and hang out and help out, and Jack would shoo him away and Ken would come back. And so you were on the nose, completely right when you said Sierra Nevada Pale Ale is the New Albion recipe. It's a 2-row malt, Cascade hops, very clean, pure, pale ale. And I'm drinking the Old Speckled Hen, an English pale ale kind of, which is one of the beers that Jack enjoyed back then. So that's why I'm drinking that.
Oh yeah, I'm horrible. See, this is why I need my co-host. Yeah, we're drinking beer.
Yeah, we're drinking a beer.
Okay, so
it's
Old
a great
Speckled
story to tell over a beer or three, I always say.
Okay, so you've got an English pale ale, Old Speckled Hen. And what's the brewery?
It's a brewery in the UK.
Okay.
I don't remember. But I guess it was originally brewed as an homage to an MG. Yeah, it's Green King Moreland Brewery. I just looked it up online. How about that?
Okay.
Yay, internet.
Yeah,
it's malty and has a little bit of hops to it, but very balanced.
Awesome. Oh, kind of jealous.
What are you drinking?
I am drinking. This is from 512 Brewing, which is in Austin, Texas. 512 is our area code. This is a Smash IPA, so single malt, single hop, and it is showcasing the Mackinac hop, which is a hop out of Michigan.
So Mackinac is how you pronounce that.
Mackinac. Oh, you don't pronounce the C at the end.
No.
Oh.
I've been to Mackinac Island. And you did say I was from Michigan in your original podcast. No, Ohio. Oh. Thank you very much.
Oh,
Big
sorry.
Big rivals. If you know anything about college football.
I do. Big rivals. What is it in Ohio? They like cover all the M's or something?
Oh, we put an X in the M's during the week that we play Michigan, which is always Thanksgiving week. Can't use an M.
Gotcha. Yeah. I have a friend whose son went to dental school at Ohio State, and she went out there and she was telling me all the things I needed to know.
All the things
about the Ohio and Michigan rivalry.
Yeah. Well, I didn't grow up in Ohio, but I came to college here, and more or less I've been in Ohio ever since. I grew up in Maryland, not too very far from where Linda and Jack met. My parents were from Ohio, my adoptive parents, and that's how I ended up back here.
Where are you now?
Well, this week I'm visiting a friend in North Carolina.
Oh, okay.
And he's a Brit, so that's why he had a bit of Old Speckled Hen on hand.
Nice.
So it seemed appropriate.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. I lived in Raleigh, North Carolina for a time. So my husband, Paul, who I mentioned, who helped me find Jack, he passed away about 9 years ago. And for a period of about a year and a half, I just needed a change of scenery. And I had always wanted to live in North Carolina, so I moved to Raleigh. And while I was here, I actually brewed a batch of New Albion Pale Ale with Raleigh Brewing Company, which is owned by a lovely married couple, but led by the wife. So they are a women-owned brewery, and
Awesome.
they did a great job with the recipe. And then I don't know if you're aware that there's a Smithsonian display about the roots of craft beer in the United States. It's in the American History Hall, the same hall as Julia Child's Kitchen. It's called Brewing a Revolution, and they had a party in November of 2019 to kick off this exhibit, and Raleigh Brewing brewed the beer for that party, and we got to reunite Jack with Ken Grossman and Fritz Maytag from Anchor Steam, and Charlie Banforth from UC Davis, and it was a lovely event, and probably Jack's last public appearance. His health has gone downhill in recent years, and it was right before the pandemic, of course. But I was so happy to get him to that event and share New Albion with people. And anyone can go visit this exhibit today. So it's pretty cool.
That's awesome. So you said that was 2019.
2019.
I think I saw a picture of that. Like, he's got the big beard going.
He did. He had the big beard going at the time. Now, I like to refer to him as the original hipster bearded brewer. You know, if you look at some of the older pictures of him from the 70s, he was on in Food and Wine magazine in 1978. There's a great photograph of him with his leather apron, you know, that he fashioned himself based on the brewers that he knew in Europe. He was very much interested in the tradition of brewing and ales, porters, and stouts, and wanted to bring that to the United States because, of course, when he got back to the United States after being overseas, all there was to drink was Bud Miller Coors, and that's not what he wanted to drink. So he thought, if I like this, probably other people will like this too, and started his little brewery with a couple of, as you mentioned, female partners, which is great.
Yeah, I think we even said, you know, their names probably don't come up as much as his, although, you know, of course he was sort of the mastermind behind it, but just really cool that, especially at that time, to have female partners and sharing a lot of the workload.
So, by the way, the Museum of Sonoma, right now, they just opened a museum that is all about hops in that region, and I shipped some items for their display. So if you visit the History Museum of Sonoma right now in the city of Sonoma, there is a beer display that includes New Albion memorabilia that's happening right now. And in July, they're going to have a beer fest in the garden at the museum, and I'm hoping to get to that. What's super cool about that, too, is Don Barkley, who is his head brewer and his partner. You mentioned Don in your earlier podcast. I think he's going to brew a batch of New Albion to serve at the beer fest in July in Sonoma. So that's going to be kind of a cool thing.
Man, I might have to go.
Right?
Awesome. And my friend is there. He's he's actually, we grew up together in Davis.
Okay.
Which is kind of cool because that UC Davis you mentioned has such a great brewing program, hop development program. So that's pretty cool. But so he's out there. So if I can't go, I'll definitely get him to go.
Okay. Oh, well, maybe I'll get a chance to meet him. You'll have to tell me his name. But one of the other things that I really appreciated in your original podcast, you talked about the fact that Anchor Steam had been out there for quite a long while before New Albion. And what's the difference? What makes one the OG and the other one not? But I think you hit the nail on the head when you said what Anchor Steam was, and when Fritz Maytag took it over, it had been a brewery since the 1800s. It had survived Prohibition by doing things like making ice cream and delivering milk and things like that. But Fritz didn't take that from scratch and build it up. What Jack did was a microbrewery. He was a welder. He welded his own brewing kettles. He had his recipes. He brewed them himself, very small batches. He created the signage, the point of sale signs that he would deliver with the beer to the places that were carrying his beer in Oakland and San Francisco. You couldn't point to a catalog and say, oh, I need this many bags of malt and this much hops. He ordered a train car of malt because that's the only way he could order it. And
that was the unit size of ordering.
That was the unit size, and he had to keep it from sprouting. He had to keep it dry. And people say, Jack, why did you choose to use Cascade hops in your recipe? And he said, because that's what the farmer had. It was not a big choice. Right. So, but to get to the reboot, which is kind of where I come in. So I meet Jack as an adult, and he has no other children. He's not been married. So he and I start bonding over this beer story. Now, I'm in Cleveland, where Great Lakes Brewing Company was founded in 1988. And that was kind of my gateway beer, besides Sam Adams, into craft beer. And of course, I couldn't go back to drinking the stuff I drank in college, in earlier years than that. So Pat Conway, who founded Great Lakes in Cleveland, was like, oh, yeah, I know all about your dad. He inspired me, just to know that you could have this model and you could brew this and people would come and be interested in drinking these beers. So I said, let's go to a beer festival. Let's go to the Great American Beer Fest. And now you had alluded to someone that worked for Sam Adams that found Jack in their
a homebrew club or something.
So that's Megan Anderson. So Jack adored Megan, still does today. She's in the non-alcoholic beer space today. But she was working for Sam Adams, and Jim Cook and Sam Adams, they trained their salespeople well. She knew who he was. It was when he showed up in her home brewers club in Texas. Gotcha. That's where she was living at the time. So she calls Jim Cook and says, guess who's in my home brewing club? Jack McAullife. And he's like, what? And, he talked about how he had acquired the intellectual property of New Albion so the big guys wouldn't get it, when it came into the public domain. And he's like, well, I have to meet Jack. Now, Jack connected Megan and I as two women in beer over email. And so I'm at GABF in 2011 in Colorado, and Megan and I bump into each other. I mean, I don't even think I realized she was going to be there. And she's like, you're here. Is your dad here? I'm like, oh, yeah, we're walking around. And I'm like, I'm walking around the Great American Beer Fest with Jack, and I'm going, see what you started? And do you know what he said? Obama owes me a lot of money. That's what he said. I'm like, yeah, he probably does. But so Megan said, well, you have to come to the long shot breakfast we're having tomorrow. So Sam Adams holds this long shot brewing contest for home brewers to announce the winner of this year's contest. And Jim's going to be there, and you need to bring Jack. So Paul and I, my husband and I, were there with Jack, and actually my Aunt Kathy that I had originally connected with was there. And we bring Jack to ahead of time. And I was standing there as Jim Cook and Jack McAullife are being introduced. And I have to tell you, there wasn't a dry eye around that table. And he said, Jack, meeting you is like meeting Sam Adams. That's what he said. And he said, you really should come to the brewery. I don't know if you know this, but I own the intellectual property for New Albion. And at the time, we did not know this. We hadn't even thought about it.
Yeah.
And we're like, what? So he's like, all right, so we'll be in touch. And so in 2012, Jack and I went to Boston Brewing, and we worked with their head brewer. And we had worked with, Don Barkley, who still had all the recipes, to get the recipe to Boston Beer. And we brewed that initial Sam Adams homage to New Albion, the original recipe. And then Jim and Jack went on this national tour. And the following Great American Beer Festival in 2012, Jim and Jack went on stage and told the world about it. And a lot of craft beer drinkers didn't know that story. And I got to be there for that too. And then he did give Jack the proceeds from that run of the beer. He said, Jack, a lot of us made a lot of money on your idea. You were just a little ahead of your time. And you said in your podcast that he gave it all to me, which he did not. Fortunately, it was enough money for Jack, who was on disability, to be able to build a little cool spot in Arkansas where he was living at that time and retire. And he did give me some seed money to create an LLC, which I formed and called the Brewer's Daughter LLC, doing business as New Albion. And that's when Jack said, Renee, this is not my thing anymore. If you want to do something with it, go ahead. So that's when I created the LLC and started brewing with platform beer in Cleveland, Ohio, which was the brainchild of a couple of guys who wanted to use brewing as a platform to help teach other home brewers how to brew. They ran a home brew shop, and they ended up a few years down the line. They were great partners with us at first. We had some parties with Jack. So there was the initial Boston beer run. Then Jim gave all the intellectual property and all the proceeds of that run back to Jack. I formed my LLC, and we partnered with Platform in Cleveland. And a few years later, they were acquired by Anheuser-Busch. They were a very fast-growing brewery. And I kind of said, hey, guys, can't really go forward with you. And they understood. And also at that time, sadly, my husband passed away. And that's when I needed kind of a fresh perspective and moved down to Raleigh. So brewed with Raleigh while I was down there. We did the Smithsonian thing. And then when I decided it was time to come home to Ohio again, because my kids were up here and my mom was up here, my adoptive mom, we ended up partnering with Brewdog USA, who they are based in Scotland, where Jack was originally, stationed and learned to brew. It was such a full circle moment. And Brewdog had brought their first American brewery to Columbus, Ohio. So I met with them, and they loved the story. And of course, they knew about New Albion. So we did a run of the beer with them. And right now, I'm not partnered with anybody. We'll see what happens going forward. But again, I'd like to keep my dad's story out there and in the public. And this is why I do this. And love to visit with him. And he always asks me, what's going on with the beer? And it's been a fun way for me to get to know him. And we've been together for almost 20 years now.
That's awesome. So even going into first meeting Jack, you had a love of beer?
I did. Again, yeah. I mean, familiar. I worked in news and media. And so I was very aware of Great Lakes and what they meant to Cleveland and that whole story. But until I really kind of jumped into Jack's story and started trotting him out to these beer festivals and meeting Sam Calagione and Jim Cook and Ken Grossman and finding out what he meant to the beer world, that was, part of getting to know my own story too.
That's awesome. I kind of wanted to get your thoughts and maybe what, maybe what Jack thinks a little bit too on craft beer today, where we're at.
Oh, sure. I'll tell you what he thinks. First of all, when you go out with Jack to have a beer, and there's a little brewery in his corner of Northwest Arkansas that he likes a lot called Creekside in Siloam Springs. I visited him in November, and we went out to that. He always orders his pale ale, not an over-hopped IPA. Any of the modern-day beers that have like more than a handful of great ingredients, he calls them hula hoop beers. He doesn't want a hula hoop beer. He wants a ale porter or stout.
I think it's almost all hula hoop beer now.
Yeah, I know. So, and he is very excited and pleased to see that so many towns have their own breweries these days, because that's what he experienced in Europe. Towns had their own brewery. I mean, he doesn't feel like every beer needs to be in your supermarket and be distributed. And, he really liked the European model, and that's what he enjoys seeing. And, when I took him to the first GABF in 2011 that we went to together, I think there were like 4,000 breweries around the country, and we've got more than double that now.
Yeah. How about your thoughts?
I tend to agree with him. I don't mind trying different things and different styles. One of the things that I've adapted from him is people will say, Jack, what's your favorite beer? And he would always say the one in my hand. So that's what I say, because I like to try different brewing styles. And Ohio is one of the states where we have quite a lot of craft beer growth, and I'm always up for, when I'm visiting anywhere, trying something new. But I do tend to go back to that pale ale, which is what I'm drinking here with my old Speckled hen.
Yeah, I agree. Well, so I love hoppy beers.
I do too. Yeah.
All the IPA, the double, triple.
I don't like to rip my palate up anymore. Like for a while there, that was the thing, and I've kind of gotten away from that. Yeah. But I like a hoppy beer.
Yeah, the good thing is I wasn't in a hoppy beer during the real huge IBU wars.
Right,
so that's good. The return back to sort of the West Coast style, much more tempered now.
Yes.
So I do actually I prefer that over, the hazy stuff.
Yeah, I agree.
But it's much more, it's, it's approachable now.
Right.
for,
I
for a
agree.
while it was not. But I will say, if there's an ESB on a menu, that's what I'm gonna order. Now you don't see it
Uh-huh.
very often, but
Right.
I love that. I love that like lightly hopped
I do too. And
malty style.
I'm all about beer pairing beers with foods, and that's something I like to do a lot as far as beer education. As the brewer's daughter, I will often for charity events auction a beer basket of craft beers, and with it a certificate for a night with the brewer's daughter, where I'll take a couple hours and I'll walk people through some pairings and the history of New Albion. I always throw that in. But one of the things I've really enjoyed is getting women to enjoy craft beer, and that's grown like crazy. I don't think it's a man or a woman thing. I think once they're introduced to different flavor profiles, they get it. And, when you pair a wine with a food, it's always a grape. But beer can have so many different flavor profiles. It can match with just about anything. So I love talking about that kind of stuff.
That's awesome. Yeah, one of my favorite experiences of all time was doing the paired thing before the GABF.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I just remember eating oysters, drinking I think it was a brown ale or something. And I was like, this is it. I've unlocked the secret to happiness right here.
And I have been known to put a scoop of vanilla in a nice malty, chocolatey porter too. Why not?
There you go. Hey, I put vanilla ice cream into a Brooklyn Black Ops.
Yes, that would be delicious.
So
yes,
I'm with you there.
Yeah, there's no wrong. There's no wrong. It's whatever you like. I don't like to think I'm not a beer snob. I just appreciate the history, and everybody likes what they like, and that's okay.
Yeah, we did an episode. We tried to decide if we were beer nerds or beer snobs, and I think we decided we're a little both. But
yeah. Well, anyone that says I want a bud, I am a little snobby about, because that's not beer.
Well, especially nowadays, a lot of these brewers, especially here in Austin, I mean, lagers are king here in Austin, craft lagers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And
that's
so many
a whole
good
trend.
Yeah, there's so many good lagers now that
there are.
It's silly to drink macros, I think, unless you really, really just don't want to spend any money at all.
Right. And hey, I understand a lawnmower beer. I get it. I'm not gonna pound a heavily hopped beer after I've mowed the grass. I've been known to drink, something a little lighter and, more readily accessible at the end of a day of lawn work. But that's not what I go to when I walk into a bar to have dinner and a drink.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think one of the challenges still, surprisingly, is getting good craft beer into some bars and restaurants and stuff, or restaurants knowing how to serve craft beer. I've been served craft beer just in the can, and I'm like, no, I got to pour it. I have to pour this out. I am a beer snob enough that I need my beer poured out
correctly. Yes, and not just sipping it out of a can, right?
So that's kind of something I've seen evolved. It kind of depends on where you are, honestly, in the country.
I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me and kind of hearing where we are today with it. Again, my purpose is to keep Jack's story out there. He's still around. He doesn't tell it so much anymore. Fortunately, Teresa McCullough, who was the curator for the Smithsonian exhibit, did an oral history with him that is in their archives several years ago. His memory is not quite as sharp anymore. He had a terrible car accident over 10 years ago, and that has taken its toll over the years. But, he's still in great spirits. He always asks about the beer, but he's just not ready to. He's like, Renee, you're the face of the beer now. So I'm like, okay, I'll do that.
Well, that's amazing. I have to admit, it was a while doing the podcast before I even was like, wait a second, because in my mind it was Ken Grossman, really.
Yeah. It's the story people don't know. It's the backstory to Ken, and you did mention how Fritz and Jack did a lot of lobbying in California to change the laws. In fact, when Jack went to work for Mendocino Brewing after New Albion folded, you couldn't serve food and beer in the same place, which seems counterintuitive. And Fritz and Jack worked to change that law so you could serve beer and food together. It just doesn't make sense. But that was a California law at the time.
Yeah, and there's still states that have some pretty backwards laws
Oh,
regarding
yes.
beer, and so
Alcohol in general.
yeah, I mean, even here in Texas, we've got some weird ones. So it is cool to have even from not just from a brewing standpoint of him being a sort of a revolutionary and an inspiration, but just from beer laws, from changing the idea of I'd say I use the word revolution, but I don't use it lightly. I do think a lot of minds had to be changed around not only just beer laws, but breaking into, against big beer, right?
Right. And that was what Jack was up against when he wanted to expand, and he went to those banks. And I know there's several versions of the story floating around why it folded, but truly, he said, the banker looked at him and was like, why would you start a new beer company and go against Bud Miller Coors? It's like starting a new car company and going against Ford and Chevy. Why would you do that? They just did not understand what he was trying to accomplish.
They never do.
Yeah. Well, that's the spark of genius that's behind it, and it's why he is known as the father of craft beer and my father. So I used to write a beer blog. Cool. I don't keep up with it anymore, but I am on Twitter as Brewer's Daughter, and there's a little Facebook page that goes along with that. And I do keep a New Albion Brewing Company Facebook page too. If people want to, I do post some things there. So if people want to see what's happening with it these days, or I post a lot of, when I find things like your podcast, I post that there.
Well, I have to say I appreciate that. That was really cool. Just the fact that we crossed paths and came together on this is honestly a super big honor for me.
Oh, I'm happy to do it. And beer brings people together. Beer people are good people. I've said that all along. And I'm really glad that, my life path led me to finding Jack and finding my way down this road.
That's a very cool story.
Thanks again for having me on, Steve. Sorry to miss your partner in podcasting, but I'll continue to keep you on my radar and listen into some of your podcasts.
Awesome. Yeah, we will keep in touch, and maybe in that Sonoma Beer Fest we can connect.
Oh, yeah. I'm hoping to get there in July.
Awesome. Thanks again. And this was Attenuation, a beer podcast with Renee DeLuca, the brewer's daughter, the daughter of Jack McAullife. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to this episode of Attenuation, a Beer Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Instagram or Facebook for lots of extra fun content. See you next episode. Cheers.